Hey guys, as you know, our world is going through an unprecedented time during the COVID-19 pandemic. To strike out this virus, we, as coaches, have partnered with Fred Hutch Research Institute, who is working on the front lines to stop the spread of COVID-19. Please consider donating to hashtag Coaches versus COVID, and here's a word from Hutch.
Your support for Fred Hutch is a strike against COVID-19 and a step toward a healthier world. Right now, Hutch scientists with expertise in infectious disease, immunology, public health, and data science are working urgently to speed up testing, track the spread of the virus in real time, and safely test new treatments and vaccines. Your contribution to Coaches versus COVID will help expand this urgent work. Donate now at fredhutch.org/coaches versus COVID.
Hello and welcome to Ahead of the Curve. I am Jonathan Gellner, and thank you so much for joining us. Today we have on the pitching coordinator for the Baltimore Orioles, Chris Holt. Chris oversees the development of every pitcher in the organization, and another major role of the coordinator is coaching coaches. So on the show, we talk about how he builds in autonomy and lets the coaches in the system utilize their strengths. We also talk about how we can embrace who the player is, but also help them improve. And we talk about what he thinks the next wave of pitching development is. You're going to love this episode. And welcome, Chris Holt. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. So I'm really excited to dig into some pitching development, but let's talk a little bit about your development as a coach. And I know that our listeners are eager to get to know you a little bit. So if you don't mind, just give us a short snapshot of why you decided to get into coaching and where you're at currently.
Yeah, I think coaching chose me. I knew after I got drafted in 2001, or excuse me, 2002, that an 86 mile an hour heater and a bunch of curveballs probably wasn't going to play for a whole lot of time in pro ball. But I honestly, I always wanted to coach. I was always interested in that side of things. I remember doing camps and when I was a college player and really getting involved with players in those camps, for whatever the $5.25 an hour it was for working camp. And but honestly, it was as soon as I was done playing pro ball, I actually went to Europe and played a little baseball over in Europe for a year and started coaching. And so I was a player coach. And then I had my own team that I was working with that was a train ride away. And my first coaching experience is kind of funny, John, because I had anywhere between 4 to sometimes 6 guys that would show up at this little town in Austria. And so what are you going to do with 6 guys at a practice? I mean, it took a little BP. We did some throwing, and then I was like, you know what? We got to play double or nothing, which is a game that I grew up playing in. I'm from Portland, Maine, so when we didn't have enough guys down at the ballpark, we played double or nothing. So it was like 3 guys on each team. You hit the ball, you got to make it to second. It's a force out, and that was the first coaching experience I had with baseball over in Austria, and then working with the team that I played for, working with the pitchers and working on some hitting things with those guys, defensive positioning. I always just loved the game. Always wanted to kind of teach, and once I started embracing that, I had an opportunity come. Dave Barnett from Flagler College, where I played, called me while I was in Europe and offered me the pitching coach job at Flagler. And so I came back in fall of 2004. I think I landed in Miami, and we had 2 hurricanes coming through Florida at the time. So, got back to Florida and then started fall ball right away. And I was off and running as a coach. And then, so in terms of why I coach, I just have always enjoyed working with players, watching them improve. I think the relationships aspect of it is probably the most important thing. I mean, wins and losses and improvement is all going to be a part of it, but working with guys and really having an impact on lives is the most important aspect of it.
Sure, I love that. I think that A big reason that we get into coaching is because the coaches that we had an impact on us, and we want to be able to pay that forward. And you're able to, as a coordinator, for those listening who may not know what coordinators do, the best advice that I could say is they coach the coaches. So they have an outline of a plan that they want to accomplish from the organizational standpoint, and they are able to just kind of see it from a macro perspective, and then coach the coaches into the micro details of their own team, or for you for pitching mechanics and data and different things like that, which is really cool. But I'm sure that comes with some different challenges and some different things that you've learned along your way. But just as a coordinator, tell us a little bit about how you get buy-in with coaches, some different challenges, and then we can dissect this answer or this question a little bit more. But just tell us a little bit about what your process is as a coordinator to make sure that, one, your coaches are well prepared, they feel competent, but also how you support them, how you push them, and just some different things that you go through.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think I'd have to start with, I got into pro ball in 2014 with the Houston Astros, and this was just before everything with data and analytics and applying all the tech to pitching. Like, this was just ahead of that curve. And so I had a year in pro ball where, I was a regular pitching coach and doing, normal things that at the time were probably a little more progressive for pro ball, having come up under, reading, reading and following the work of, Brent Strom, Derek Johnson, Lance Wheeler was a good friend of mine. I was a Paul Nyman student for quite some time. So, applying all these things that were at the time different than everything else that was going on in pro ball. I've always had that approach with players and coaches alike, which is I want to make sure that we're not just doing the vanilla program. We want to work to get the most out of every guy. We want to identify what guys do well. And that goes for players and coaches. I've had a number of conversations with players over the years. Like, you have to do certain things your way. It's not going to work my way for everybody. And I know that as a coach. And I also know that as a coordinator, where I really want coaches to be themselves. I really want them to use their own skill sets to solve problems. I have things in our system. I have things that we want to achieve as goals, and we have a systematic structure with how that works. But you've got to be able to be yourself and utilize your own strengths. And so I encourage that for both players and coaches. You've got to do certain things your own way to do it right.
No, I really like that answer, and I think that if you, and I'm sure you hire the right guys that want that. And so, being I've never been a head coach, and I've never had the privilege of really coaching other coaches from the perspective that you have. So I've always been an assistant. And so anytime that I've been given responsibility or I've been given autonomy, I take it as like a badge of honor of like, hey, this guy trusts me. And this, and that's something that I am constantly seeking. And I'm sure that's the same for you, as you see that and you give them more, the more that they earn it. But let's say that you're the coordinator, and you have some different organizational philosophies that you guys have, and then you hire a coach from another organization, and maybe he doesn't know what the philosophies are yet. So how do you make sure that you ensure buy-in with that? Is that through the interview process, or even if something, let's say something that is really important to you slips by, and a guy that you hire um, may or may not disagree? What does that
Yeah,
conversation look like? Because I
yeah,
think
and
that's
I
also an
understand that.
interesting dynamic.
Yeah, the premise of the question is sometimes coaches are kind of stuck in their ways, or they have their own ideas about how they want to do things, and you've got to kind of convince these guys that they've got to do it your way. I honestly haven't encountered that. I've had the good fortune, honestly, John, of coming up through an Astros system where I was asked and encouraged to contribute to the program. So Doug White, who was the coordinator at the time when he brought me on, um, he leaned on every one of us to contribute to the program, ideas for throwing program, for workload management, for the delivery, for all the aspects of the program. And so I had the good fortune of working in that organization where I was there to help build what we were doing and make some changes to what had been going on in the past. And then coming over to Baltimore in 2019, this was something where I had all coaches who had been here before, and it was less about trying to get buy-in. It was more about here's what we've been doing, here's the direction we're working to go, and so let's really dive into this and understand a few things that we want players to understand. And it's not about, hey, you have to agree or disagree with this. It's like, this is the work we're working to do with these guys. We have very clear objectives. So we really don't have time to get involved in discussions of disagreement or this and that. It wasn't about that. It was about, let's do the work. And here's how we're going to go about doing it. We ask players to improve what they're doing. We use a what, why, how approach, and honestly, giving the coaches the same what, why, and how really leaves little room for discussion in terms of, we're not trying to get buy-in. We're working to get work done.
I really like that answer. And, we spoke off the mic a little bit about, getting buy-in from not only coaches, but players. And so let's say that you identify a player who needs to make a change, which, happens all the time. I mean, obviously that's our job. We identify players that do things well, and then we also want to be able to try and help them with the things that need improving. And so whenever you're trying to make a change with a player, what does that conversation look like? Because again, for the listeners, the reason why I ask it like this is the players have complete ability or complete confidence in their ability to be able to do the things that they need to do, and they may have had this same pitching motion or swing their entire life, so they have a lot of confidence in that, and that's their normal, that's what they go to, that's their default. And so kind of fear of the unknown and fear of embarrassment can play a role into that. And so that's why some players don't want to make these changes. So how do you go about helping them and not necessarily convincing them, but just how do you get that buy-in of saying, hey, a little, Johnny, this is what we're going to do. What do you think about, and just walk us through a conversation of what that would look like if you were trying to change something.
Yeah, I learned quite a bit about this, especially as the assistant coordinator in Houston in 2018, where now I was working with everybody from the DSL and then, all the way up through AAA, and had the chance to work with a couple of guys in big league camp as well, who were, already big leaguers for a number of years, and having those conversations as well was, you get every end of the spectrum there. And so the short answer here is that it just depends on the level of the guy and the skill level of the current player. And so, when you're talking about trying to get buy-in from a player, I've encountered less difficulty the more we have objective data to go by, the more we have objective feedback, because it's not me trying to get you to buy into my opinion. It's like, we really know how to assess what you do well and what you need to work on. And so when we can clearly identify, here's where you're good, here's where you need work, here's what we're going to do, here's why you need to improve it or maintain it or get better with it, and here's how. And so it's really just laying out an honest assessment based on things that are not opinion. And so that's where you start, whether it's a guy in the DSL or a guy in the big league, in my opinion. And then honestly, from there, the next thing I have to really make sense of is what makes sense to the player. Can I have this player kind of put me in his shoes, invite me into his world? Because like I mentioned before, it's, you have to do certain things your way. And the more we as coaches, and the coaching skill sets now are really, really impressive with all the delivery knowledge and all the use of high-speed cameras and TrackMan. I mean, all these skill sets that new modern coaches have. It also leaves us in that realm of, we really can help guys improve, and we really feel like we can put our hands on guys and build these really good players. While that might be true, we have to really drip some of that on certain players that are already doing some things really well. And so we can embrace what a guy is doing well, how well he moves in a certain way, and then, embrace who he is, what makes him special, and then go from there. And then honestly understand what makes sense to the player first before we're trying to get him to understand what makes sense to us and how we're going to do this, this, and this, and his life is going to be great. It's really more about just that taking that first step of assessing the plan and then getting to know the player and what makes sense to him. So you can go from there. It's less about
I love that.
it's less about buy-in these days and more about just being able to square up with a guy and go, hey, look, man, you're really good here. Let's continue to hammer in on that, and then here's where you need to get better, and what do you think you need to do? Like, what's your idea first? I really like from a what, why, how standpoint. Sometimes a player has the best how. Once you show him what he needs to work on and why, he's like, oh, I can do that. He just didn't know that he had to.
No, I really like that answer, and I love again. I love getting to hear how that conversation looks like for every individual because again, we all have different strengths, just like the players do. So, getting to hear that is truly it gives me a ton of different tools in the toolbox. But also, how do we have those conversations with players who may not be owning their career like we want them to? So, say a player may be not working as hard as we want them to, or from the pitching side, they may not be owning their routine, or coming up with their own. I mean, you mentioned several different organizational philosophies that you guys feel are important, but you also have an individual piece. You said. So how do we help them to become their own best coach?
Well, if a guy, it depends on what level the guy's at. I mean, we have a lot of guys in the lower
Absolutely.
levels who simply from a maturity, adulthood standpoint, don't really know how to manage their career. Part of our job at those levels is to be giving the constant feedback and forming those quality habits and work habits from a young age on. If you're dealing with guys in the double A, triple A range who just don't do good work or don't have a work ethic that's going to allow them to improve in the time they have remaining to try to do this thing. Honestly, I just have that conversation. I don't really feel that there's any way of being nice about that to where we're going to feel all warm and fuzzy leaving the room. It's like, you
Sure.
know, you're 24 years old and you are in double A and you need to work on this or this, or else you probably go home in a year. And
Hmm.
so it's up to you what you want to do. I'm here to help and I'm here to get you a plan if you don't have one. But clearly, what you've been doing hasn't been working. So something's got to get done. And so I don't shy away from those conversations, John. I think that the more we understand that we don't have a lot of time in this game, none of us do, players, coaches, anything. We're all just passing through. And I share that sentiment with players. We don't have time to waste, so let's not waste time.
I love that, and it's something that I think we as coaches, and this, long story short, I think sometimes we have a tendency to err on the side of love and helping them to feel better, but I also think that telling the truth has a lot of love too. Because and somebody mentioned this the other day of who are you the most truthful with, and it's usually like your best friends and your family. And if we're not close enough to be able to tell the truth with our players, again with love, we don't want to beat them down and make them quit, um, if we're not truthful with them, then how close really are we? And so that was a challenge for me the other day when I can't remember who said it, but I really like that. And you've talked a couple of times about learning the player and getting to know them. What are some tips on just how we can figure out what motivates them the most? And really, we've heard the term "learn the learner" a lot, but what does that mean to you?
Well, I think that the only way I can think to answer that right away is understanding, where they come from, what their background is, and just and being able. You can't have this conversation, hitting a fungo in the outfield during BP. It's like this is more about being able to actually spend some time in the office with a guy and you know tell me a little bit about yourself and what'd you learn from your high school coach and what did you keep when you went to college and how'd you really
Hmm.
get better in college, like kind of getting a background on the timeline of their development up to that point is really really helpful because I can't tell you how many times I've had guys tell me that something they did with their high school coach or a high school travel guy back when they were 16 is where they really took off, and it's like that's what made sense to them. That's where they first broke through. It's like, well, that's pretty important stuff. And
Absolutely.
as much as I know about ground forces and rotational planes and all these things that I know about the delivery, it's like they don't they don't necessarily benefit from that if they're not doing what got them good in the first place. And so for me to kind of again get a window into what makes sense to them, like hand over ownership of the things that they do own and identify those things, and then I also identify the things that they don't own. If you don't own certain parts of your repertoire or your command or your delivery, then you're probably renting it at best. And so identifying those things that we own and really allowing them to take ownership and really continue to hammer those things in with through their habits, through their daily repetitions, and then what are we renting? What do we got to continue to go work on every single day so that we now start to own all those other things and really put our game together so that we own our entire game. Because they're going to have other coaches than me or in our organization. It's like the job is so that they learn and can go perform for us first and foremost, and then but really again graduate to self correction and being able to own their entire game.
For sure, that's a great point. So on the practice side, do you guys utilize competitive bullpens or anything like that?
Yeah, so when I was with the Astros, we started doing competitive bullpens back. I think it was as early as 2015. I remember the first ones we did. We had a lot of rain for a stretch of days in Kissimmee, and good old Kissimmee. And so we were doing competitive bullpens in the cages, and then we would carry some of that on to into the short season where I was coaching in Tri-City. So for guys that were paired off in a tandem, occasionally we would do competitive bullpens. We learned pretty quick that as you get into the summer and guys start scaling back the intensity and the volume of their overall work, that at times it was more about just tracking the individual's work. And so competing with yourself or, competing with your bullpen plan is a way sometimes you had to boil it down, just to save workload. But in terms of competitive bullpens, the last example I can give you is I'll play a game with guys when I rove called One Shot. So they'll throw their regular bullpen and then we'll finish with a game called One Shot, and you're competing against me. And so what I do is I give you the pitch and the location, the situation, the bat side, the count, and then you get one shot, just like you do in the game. And if you hit your spot, you execute your pitch, then I owe you 10 push-ups. And if you don't, then you owe me 10 at the end. And so we just keep track. And so you'll see me doing push-ups or some other embarrassing exercise if they executed their their competitive
I
bullpen
love
with
that.
me. And I just call it one shot. You got one shot, just like the game, and then I gotta wear it if you execute.
Oh, that's fantastic. Anytime that that we can get over the fear of embarrassment and we can embarrass ourselves in front of our players, I think we can, you talk about buy-in, but talk about buy-in. That's a way that we can do that, especially whenever we're vulnerable with those guys. I think that they can definitely get behind that. For me, from the outside looking in on the pitching side, I think that there's a lot of things that everyone we're on an equal playing field with as far as data goes. It seems like everyone has it all. We all have access to the same amount of things from an analytical standpoint, and this may or may not be the case. But what's next? Like, what's the next direction that pitching goes, and looking into the future, if you were like, hey, I think that this would be really cool, or I think that eventually we're going to get to this point, and just, obviously is we all have the same amount of stuff, but what's next in the pitching world?
So in terms of the data and the tech and applying all these things, in my mind, what really constitutes the next wave is totally maximizing the effectiveness, not just of a pitcher's repertoire, but the ins and outs of how guys are going to sequence. And so whether you're a guy that reads fan graphs and you're looking at spin mirroring, or you're looking at general TrackMan information, being able to maximize the weapons that a pitcher has, and then being able to, round out the rest of the repertoire to maximize the effectiveness and the sequencing based on the science. So I feel like at some point there will be some sort of code cracked here on what is, and we know like Perry Husband's done amazing work with the effective velocity and tunneling and sequencing. Like we've been seeing Perry Husband's work for years, and it can be very difficult to execute. It can be very difficult to grasp some of those concepts if you're a player, but really starting to boil down the science that's contained within the numbers to be able to get at the sequencing that makes you most effective, whether it's because of your delivery, your release point metrics, or your spins out of hand. It's maximizing that player's total efficiency, deception, and sequencing capabilities.
Cool. That's a tough question to answer because again, we're in such a time of turmoil right now, I guess, in our game. With for those listening, maybe in 10 years from now, we're currently going through COVID-19, and so it's kind of tough to peer into the future and see what's going on. But I think that it's a really cool thing to think about. But on the subject of knowing our audience, we have a lot of amateur coaches that are listening. So, what are some different common problems that you see? Just things that come up consistently that you're like, hey, we could have fixed this in high school, or it's just something that you see that maybe we should do before they get to you, or just some different things that you fix on a consistent basis that will help that have helped players in the past.
Yeah, that's a really, really important question because the most important things that get ingrained in players are the things that are going on early in development and way ahead of where we get them. And so the first thing that always jumps out at you is whether a guy moves athletically or not. Does he have a really solid grasp of rhythm and tempo and overall timing to get his stuff as good as he can get it and get it through the zone? I think those basic pieces, if those can be in place by the end of high school, obviously the college coaches are going to benefit from that as well. But the guys that have a solid grasp of athleticism, rhythm, and tempo, they're so far ahead of just all the mechanical knowledge because ultimately, when you're under the lights, it's tough to think about mechanics. But if you can always return to rhythm, tempo, timing, aggression, athleticism, and be on the attack, having that ability and that mindset to get back to that or to establish it in the first place is always going to be the most important thing. So as coaches, I think it's important for us to early on choose our verbiage wisely with how we're going to build intent with a player. And intent is the buzzword. We know that, but it's really about the intent behind the work as opposed to just the
Mm-hmm.
intent to throw hard. You know, what makes me special? It's I'm on time and I rip my stuff through the zone. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. I think if to get a little more granular on that, um, it can be really difficult later on to change, to make the changes that improve both performance and overall health. So, as much knowledge that is out there these days, and as many kids that are doing plyo balls and different programs from Driveline and the Ranch and all these other places, you see a lot of kids coming out with really really solid movement patterns. But for them to understand how to put that all together in rhythm and tempo and be able to maximize that feel for pitching that goes hand in hand with maximizing the stuff and maximizing the efficiency of the delivery. The combination, that next wave of guys is going to have high octane stuff, but also have this feel for pitching, as opposed to just high octane stuff that they just chuck through the zone without having an understanding on how to pitch.
Okay. A couple different directions that I want to go with that because I think that's a very fascinating answer. Number one, obviously, for our listeners, I think that you're right. I think intent has been correlated with throwing the ball really hard all the time, but intent is just having a purpose. Like it's just, I'm intending to do this, and we can insert whatever we want within that. And so for me, interpreting what you said, you're kind of talking about pitchability along with stuff. So this is something that from the hitting side that I've been curious about is we are adjusting to, obviously tunneling as best we can because it's freaking hard to hit against the guys that tunnel really well. Uh, but like the high four seam, you start to see that as something that the hitting side is teaching more Do you think that eventually we'll go back to sinker slider guys? Because for me, I just see it as a pendulum that keeps being swung back and forth within the pitching and hitting world. So it's like, okay, hitters adjust to this finally, and or we think that we have, and so then pitchers just throw something else at us, and we're like, shit. Well, I don't know exactly what to do. But what do you think? I mean, do you think that there eventually we'll go back to like two seam sinker and slider guys?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that the one of the things that helped the sinker slider guys, establish themselves so effectively at that point in the game and the evolution of the game was the strike zone was much wider and much flatter. So at this point, with the improvements that we've made to tracking strike zone measurements, and now we know that there's a much more defined strike zone that's more north and south. Obviously, it's going to play into the capabilities of those guys that have a vertical attack, four seam fastball and some sort of curveball or breaking ball with depth. So I don't see that cycle coming back around to where sinker slider guys are the next dominant wave. Also, given the fact that most of the swing mechanics now are geared towards, covering that bottom part of the zone so well by default. It's like sinker slider guys tend to just kind of run into some barrels without making hitters have to earn it. And so the next wave, the next cycle in my mind will be guys that can generate both a vertical and a horizontal attack, both in a high quality mix based off of that. So if you will, the four seam fastball of Justin Verlander paired with the 12-6 curveball of a David Eickhoff to a sinking or a two seam fastball that's Greg Maddux like, and then a slider that mirrors that, and then a changeup that's just sink and tail, and just this nightmare repertoire that all pitchers, because of the measurements we now have, will now be able to work towards developing that as a repertoire. So you're either an east-west guy or a north-south guy. Well, if you can become the guy that's everything and you have all weapons for all types of hitters in all situations, then that's probably the next cycle that I see, as opposed to just sinker slider guys having a resurgence across the board with an east-west attack.
Cool. I like that. Great answer. And yeah, cool. So one thing that I'm really interested in, and that's your learning. Again, we're quarantined at the time, and at COVID-19 again. We're going to have a lot of listeners in the first couple of weeks, but there may be some that are listening years down the road. So I'm trying to do my best to try and learn what I can. Whenever we didn't have the time that we thought, well, we didn't have the time that we do now. And so, what are some different things that you're really digging into, and what's something that has really caught your attention lately?
Well, I think the most important thing first is to recognize that we as an organization have really embraced this opportunity to continue to, as a group. I mean, all the new hitting coaches and fourth and fifth coaches, development coaches, like everybody has been working around the clock to attend webinars and use this opportunity for continued growth and learning as coaches. On the pitching side of things, I've got a lot of guys that are using this time to really dig into the player development plans and getting to know these guys that are in their call list groups right now. When we broke from spring training, we had each pitching coach basically assign a call list and would be in charge of any kind of remote training or player development plan work that's going on. So these guys are taking that opportunity, and everybody from our newest coach, Andy Sadowski, who's going to be in the Dominican this year. We have a new coach named Joe Hamacher who is doing the same thing. And then everybody else, Adam Blade and Robbie Avalese. I'm just name dropping for you guys, but Josh Conway will be our pitching coach at Frederick, and then Justin Ramsey, of course, and Kenny Steenstra, of course, at AAA. So all these guys have been working around the clock to improve kind of anything that they can, specifically to their needs. We identified for the coaches, like, where are your strong points and where do you feel like you need the most growth? And so getting them those resources to be able to improve their knowledge base and their skill sets over this time, and be able to put it to a little bit of work in any conversations they have with players. So that's the first thing I want to recognize is the work of
Hmm.
everybody in our organization. Matt Blood, our new director of player development, has really mobilized the entire group to embrace this time. And I can't give him enough credit for the work that he's put in with this entire group. So it really comes down to, what are we doing as a group? As far as anything I'm looking at, I'm a little more defined in what I'm looking at this point. So I've been spending a lot of time lately digging into the resources of Nick Winkelman, who's has got a new book coming out. And I'd encourage anybody to take a look, but just spending some time with his resources. He's done a few
That's
podcasts,
great.
did a webinar with us, and really looking at the art of language and how you communicate with players, and really trying to make efficient your verbal economy and getting the most effective ways of getting across information that's not confusing. And so just we've worked for years. With the Astros, we were really early on more leaning heavily towards the use of external cues and staying outside of the kind of the old school, stay over the rubber, break tall, throw downhill kind of vanilla stuff. We really got away from that early on, and
Hmm.
beyond that, started really getting into the art of cueing as opposed to mechanical imperatives and all those sorts of things. So Winkleman's work is really particularly interesting because he's approaching it from an overall, like, how do I develop athletes, and how do humans interpret information and then be able to transfer it to their own ownership and then transfer it to performance. That's the biggest category that I've been sinking my teeth into of late, and I think it's a really, really important one.
No, it's Nick. Actually came by for 3 days during spring training, and we got to spend like 9 hours with him, and just blew my mind. And I was a big fan before, just based on I think there's a ton of his stuff on SlideShare, and I think you're right. I think his book just came out, so I would definitely encourage people to pick that up because he, like you mentioned, he talks about just the language that we use, and again, we've talked several times about if we can't communicate well, then it really doesn't matter how good of a coach we are if we're the ones that are working with players every day. And so it's something that's a field that I think we're just getting started. And if you were going to ask me what another wave of player development is, I think that is one. Just effective communication, especially being simple and concise. And so just making sense to the player, which is what we've always tried to do. But I think that being able to find really good ways to do that, I think is another thing that will be really good going forward. But as far as we talked about the one shot game, which I thought was really cool. What is another thing that you guys do, or just you do in general, that your pitchers that you're working with are going to love? So like that was a competition. It could be a game. It could be just whatever. But you're going to show up on this. Like let's say tomorrow. You're going to show up tomorrow. I wish. But you're like, hey, we're gonna do this today, guys, and they go crazy. What would that be?
It just depends on the guy and the level. I think if I'm talking with a group of guys in the DSL, which I like going to that end of the conversation first because those guys are so raw and so eager to learn.
Right.
The new group of J2 drafts we had, or J2 signings we had from last year, are just, it's a big group of just guys that are willing to learn and show up and do so much every day. It's you have to pull the reins back a little bit, and so we don't have to throw to 350 feet every day, guys. These guys really like to learn um, how to get better with every little thing that they do. So like for them, it's really about how can we tailor the throwing program for you. Juan Ramirez, how do we tailor your throwing program to really improve your curveball and really just spend some quality time with this pitch? Because we're not going to give you curveball, slider, cutter, and changeup all in the same day in your DSL throwing program. So, like, again, I think that the short answer is what do we do that makes them excited about their own program, their own learning, not just, hey, here's a drill or an activity that everybody does. A lot of stuff that goes to the group gets lost on the group. And so if we're working with guys in the DSL, it's like it comes back to that plan of identifying, where are you good? Where do you need to improve? And then what's our plan? So like just the very nature of sitting down and formulating that plan and communicating that really gets guys excited, gets them really bought in, and gets them green. Keeps those leaves on the tree green for wanting to go out and get some reps on this thing today. And look, you're going to go out there, you're going to know that some of your reps are going to be awful. You're going to have so many bad reps. Like, good, fine. If you don't throw a good spinning breaking ball in your first 10 to 15 reps, fine. Like, I'm not frustrated with you. Like, you just haven't learned how to do it. So, like, just giving them the space and the encouragement, I guess you'd say, or the latitude to just, dare to do it right, dare to fail, dare to have anything in between, and just be invested and energetic in your own work, no matter what it is, because the next right thing for me as a pitcher is the next right thing, and I have to be enthusiastic about that next right thing. If you're just to, climb up the levels a little bit. So, like working with a guy like Zach Lowther last year at AA and Bowie, like here's a guy who kind of possesses a deception in his delivery and, kind of an invisible action and deception combination with with his heater, and then just trying to round out the off speed pitches and really getting him green on putting his game together in terms of being able to upset timing and anticipation, and getting him revved up with how to just make sense of the things that we use to capture the objective feedback. So whether that's looking at high speed cam info and like making sense of it, or here's what we have with TrackMan, and here's a bunch of numbers, but like, so what? Like, what does that mean? So like with where we're at, John, and as an organization, and just kind of coming into our first full season with these things totally on ramped, it's going to be a little more boiled down right now in terms of what gets guys excited. Like guys are excited about just, continuing to learn how to just go get better on their own. They're so much more invested in their own daily work at this point that it's not like we have to bring this, this competition bullpen thing to the, into camp to make it exciting. It's like, no, it's individual. It's really about what's going to help me today, as a player. And fortunately, we have the coaching staff, the curriculum with our development and the environment, the culture, to where that's what they're going to be able to go do.
Oh, great answer. And on the flip side of that, it's something that, and you did say you like to tell the truth, so I'm going to test you on this one. But we all have biases that we believe, and it can be proven or disproven through data sometimes. But through experience, we develop these different situations, whether they're good or bad. But what is something that you believe that other coaches may disagree with you about?
That's a tough one. There's just so much out there. I mean, I've since stopped kind of hanging out on and looking for stuff on Twitter. Years ago, I used to look at that, and there were just so many arguments. I think on the hitting side, it's a little hairier, but when it comes to like where I might deviate from the group in terms of what I believe, it's tough to really say. I think that perhaps I dug into the Dr. Mike Marshall work a bit more than everybody else. Dr. Mike Marshall, for those who don't know, was a major league pitcher who, he has his way of training pitchers that ultimately his main objective was to eliminate all pitching injuries. And after two guys went down in 2006 with Tommy John where I was coaching college at the time, I was like, these guys both kind of exhibit similar flaws or timing issues, and I just couldn't put my finger. I want to know why, what contributes to injury. And so I don't view everything in development from an injury prevention standpoint, but certainly having the ability to dive into initially the Mike Marshall research, and then from there medical studies. And I know Bodie and those guys at Driveline have dug into the research and been able to formulate what they do in terms of movement patterns. So it's all built in a lot of areas for a lot of guys. But, in terms of like where my own self research went into, and, digging into the Marshall stuff, and then, being able to kind of put it to use with the normal delivery. Because anybody that's seen the delivery that Marshall came up with to eliminate all injuries, it's simply not going to happen. And we know from ASMI studies that it doesn't generate high velocities consistently across the board, and generally guys have had trouble throwing strikes out of it. So it's trying to really make use of understanding what are the injury mechanisms and how does that all kind of bake back into what we do know about efficiency in the delivery and rhythm and tempo and all the things that can be boiled down to the language that you use in a conversation with a player, and how do you bake it in without it being the main focus. So it's about development and performance, but how do these things bake right into how we go about doing things? I don't know that everybody else would disagree with that as much as I don't know that it would be as much the focus. I think the last time I had any kind of discussion where I really didn't agree with something I heard, I think I'm looking at it from like, what, I need to listen to this because this goes 180 degrees against what I believe, but I need to listen to it because if I just sit here and try to stay stuck in my ways, it's just kind of the way I've been built.
Sure.
And I honestly, I credit guys like Strami and Brent Strom and, the guys that, Derek Johnson, having, heard him speak a handful of times and just all these guys that remain growth mindsets, like they never really turn away from information. I think they're in the habit of getting outside their box. I think Fred Corral puts it best. You got to get outside your box and you got to learn, you got to listen, you got to do some things, but then at the end of the day, you got to get back in your box and go pitch or go coach. And so, it's not that anything I do or think or say deviates from the group or has a lot of disagreement across the board. It's really about, what do you decide to get back in your box and go coach with or go pitch with?
Well, speaking of that, which again, I think that's a fantastic answer. And another thing that people have asked a lot on social media is just different books or resources that have really shaped everyone's coaching career. And so, what are some different ones? You've mentioned a lot of different names, and I know Derek Johnson has the pitching book or had it out for a long period of time. But the rest of those guys are really Kyle Boddy has a ton of different stuff with Driveline, but a lot of those are different conversations that you've had with other coaches. Which again, I would encourage our listeners to reach out to people who they respect and see if they have time, because I think that during this time, some of us have nothing but time at different periods in the week. But what are some different books or maybe online resources that our listeners want to or should dig into, and where would you send them?
Well, seeing that I have a copy of Nolan Ryan's Pitcher's Bible right here on my desk in the office, I would have to start with that one.
Okay.
And that was something that I picked up years ago, and just obviously he wrote it with Tom House, and I think having been a part of a circle of people that early on was really invested in learning everything they could from guys like Tom House, Ron Wolforth, and everybody that was in this thing. Nolan Ryan is able to take a lot of what was kind of verbiage and a lot of information and just kind of boil it down into what House kind of referred to as biscuits and gravy language. And so that's why I really like Nolan Ryan's Pitcher's Bible. He can illustrate some things more to feel and more to timing than perhaps the metrics and the mechanics and the biomechanics side of things. It's like, yeah, that stuff's great, but when you got a guy who really knew how to throw a baseball, putting some things to words, that one speaks to me. So that's the first one I would recommend anybody goes out and buys. Obviously, Derek Johnson's book from way back. I think that if he was to have another edition, I'm sure he could have another 500 pages added to what he's probably learned since releasing that one. But
Sure.
Anything that you can get your hands on, where guys like him, Strom, guys that have come from the college game or who are kind of self-made. there's a common theme running through all these guys who are really successful. Is they just want to continue to learn. They never turn away from information. Wes Johnson's another guy. It's like, here's a guy that, he's forgotten more than I know. And it's, he's asking me questions, and that's humbling. But to be honest with you, it's like these resources that we have, like a lot of the resources I look at are when guys are doing speaking engagements, so, going to Palooza and listening to DJs speak, and all the other coaches, all the other speakers there. A guy named Graham Lehman. Graham Lehman has a great website. For those of you who don't know, I think it's Graham Lehman Baseball at WordPress, or I'd have to kind of get that so you can link it in the bottom. But Graham Lehman gave an outstanding presentation at Palooza this year where he basically, he can outline, a lot about how to just individualize the work with players. And so I dig into a lot of stuff that maybe is a little bit off the beaten path. If you want to just talk regular resources, obviously the books and the reading is good. One book that really had an effect on me years ago was a book called Flow, and I always mess up the author's name. It's like Csikszentmihalyi, or I forget how to say his name, but it's the name of the book is Flow. Can you know that you go to the guy's name?
Oh yeah, Csikszentmihalyi. Fantastic
Yeah,
book, but don't ask me to spell it.
yeah, no, it's tough. I'm still learning English and Spanish at the same time, so it's it's combining the mental game with the physical game. I always feel like playing the game of mental game can be a little tough, but when you can combine things, into the one, such as the things that are mentioned in that book, and even in Nolan's book, and really boiling into the mental game, into the action, um, that's really where the paint hits the canvas, and that's where guys can really help learn for the player how to best do that. I think any of these resources that we have are going to be good for that. And then obviously there's a Mental ABCs book. I've always enjoyed the snippets from that. Reading it cover to cover, it's a lot, but you find those passages that make sense to you. Coming back to as a player or a coach, like you got to do certain things your way. Certain parts of these books will speak to you, and really zeroing in on those red meat pieces that really speak volumes that you can really kind of go for and latch onto. You don't have to remember everything in those books, but what speaks to you, and what becomes part of how you talk to yourself on a baseball field, as a coach, as a player, and then what makes its way into the way that you think. Obviously, your thoughts become your actions, and actions become habits, and habits become how you either have success or not. And so, any of these resources that you can kind of get into and really latch onto these pieces that help you, that's really the application,
No, that's great. And thank you for.
honestly. And the other things online, I mean, I'm a little bit of a nerd when it comes to reading some things on Fangraphs. Some of it's over my head, some of it's right in my wheelhouse. Baseball prospectus is always interesting, but Baseball America has always got good things for podcasts, and so checking in with those things once in a while, I think is kind of fun, just to kind of see what the narrative is, out there. And I always like to spend some time on the scouting side. I think in player development, and I've had a lot of coaches in the minor leagues kind of, we always talk about this, is that you get a little bit blinded by the level you're at times. And so if you're an A-ball, like you're kind of judging what you see based on the rest of the A-ball guys. What you have to keep fresh in mind, like what is a big leaguer? And so that's where we have to, I think, keep our scouting lenses on, and know what a 20 to 80 means. This guy might be really dominating with a 40 fastball, and we got to work to get it better, or his command better with it. He might be dominating with this 35 or 45 breaking ball that's, just not going to project to play in the big leagues, but he's dominating these, lower level hitters. Keeping the scouting lenses on and understanding what constitutes major league talent, major league ability, major league skill level. Anything that we can read and or listen to and or sink our teeth into online that gives us that scope, whereby we're measuring how we're getting guys better. So without, I don't have an entire library of books here, John, that I can sit here and go down, but just, really being choosy on what speaks to you as a coach, getting outside of that, and then also making it practical. Anything you're working on, like, how do you make it practical? How do you apply it?
For sure. And, another thing that I think we're all struggling with a little bit is we have so much information now. And so, what's your best advice? Because this has come up a lot, and it's something that I struggle with too, is how do we filter information? Because there's so much good info out there. What's been your process of, instead of like chasing all of these different rabbits down these different holes, being able to go, okay, yeah, I like that. Here's what I like about it. And now I'm not going to dig any deeper. I'm going to move on to something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. There's so much now for coaches, so many resources. It can be overwhelming for a lot of guys. I think the first thing I would answer that with is, again, what am I trying to learn, and does this have a place in my toolbox? Like, as much criticism as a guy like Tom House has gotten over the years for like diving in and teaching this and it didn't work or got guys hurt, or like everybody who's done this thing has been accused of having bad information or getting guys hurt or what. It's like, we know the truth is like, whatever it is that we're doing and reading and learning, we know that it has to be filtered through what you have mastery of as a coach. And so if you don't have mastery of this concept or this idea or this way of working to help develop a player, then you have to be able to work towards that end so that whatever you're reading into is going to be contributing to your mastery so that you can illustrate it to a player who can illustrate it back to you and teach you back. So I always look at it from that filter, that lens of, I'm reading about, spin rate and spin direction and this and that. It's like, okay, well, what is this? If I was a player, that would absolutely make sense. And I can, as a player, go, oh yeah, I can do that. And how do I package that in a way that I can just talk to a player in my broken Spanish or in, college English, or a guy that was a high school draft, and I got to boil it down a little bit more for a guy that's, just a little more like Nolan Ryan's biscuits and gravy language, So again, like, I have this information. How does it apply? How does it make sense? And then how do I boil it down for the individual and that range of individuals so that I can get the quality concept across, So we can read everything and know everything. It's like, that's where how much do you really know? It's in my mind, is this another tool for the toolbox, or is this context? So is this just proof? I can read all these research studies and I can get a lot of different data on different things for the delivery or for spins or, whatever the research project's about. It's like, what kind of context does this create for how I understand things and how I can explain and help a guy?
Fantastic answer. And again, in the information age that we're in, I think that's another thing that's going to be, if it's not already important to us or to you as the listener, it's got to be, because again, the guy who chases two rabbits ends up hungry, right, and catches none. But for our listeners who may want to get in touch with you and just pick your brain, is there a way, or is there somewhere online that we can find you?
Well, you can always email me at my email address is chrisholt007@gmail.com. I'm always happy to take emails. Honestly, it's I am still quite busy during this quarantine time with a full schedule and workload, at least Monday through Friday, and I will do my best to get back to everybody. That said, the number one thing that I would illustrate to listeners here is that if you're passionate about the game, whether you're a hitting coach or a pitching coach or a manager, it's like, I think this whole thing comes down to love of the game and wanting to use your passion to pass that on to players and whatever strengths and whatever facet your expertise is in. And I would just encourage all the listeners, no matter, especially guys at those lower levels or even the youth level, this is really important stuff. Like to be able to pass on the passion for the game. I feel like we're in a time where kids in general are in need for like constant entertainment, distraction. And this is not to be preaching on social issues. This is really just kind of what you see coming through, So to really encourage guys to make the game exciting and to really work to no end to help these players be as good as they can get, as quick as they can get that good. That's why players play. Why do you play the game of baseball, Billy? It's because I have success and it makes me feel good. And being able to, we're all trying to impact lives. That's great, but it's like being able to pass along passion for the game and teach the game, and really keep a hard-nosed, play the game right brand of baseball coming through the pipelines is going to be huge. So that's the one shout out I would want to give to anybody doing this, especially at the amateur level.
Thank you for listening to Ahead of the Curve. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, which could include Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, or YouTube. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please share it on social media to help get the word out. Once again, thank you for joining us.